Let's discuss how companies manage risk. Here we have a company, and the company is run by a CEO and CFO and other executives. This is my management. Management is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the business, making the decisions on what to invest in, what products to work with, and so forth. Assuming this is a public company, management is overseen by a board of directors. The board of directors represents investors of the company. Investors vote for members of the board, and they approve things like executive compensation and other main goals for the organization. They're also working to make sure that management is working in the best interest of the investors. So this whole process of protecting the organization is called governance. So governing the organization. To help protect this organization, the board of directors and management are going to implement internal controls to help make sure the operations are running efficiently, that we're minimizing risks and threats to the organization, and they are presenting information back to the investors that is a fair representation of the actual operations of the business. The next question is, where do these internal controls come from? Well, there are a number of different sources. Let's talk through a few of them. The first one that we're going to see is that we have laws and regulations, such as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires the CEO and CFO to sign off on their financial statements, not only that they're fair and accurate, but they also have adequate internal controls. We call this an internal control assessment. So this requires companies to periodically test the internal controls and to sign off saying that they are functioning as expected, that there aren't any significant internal control weaknesses. So that's the requirement, but again, where do these rules come from? Well, so there are frameworks that are available to accountants, to management, to help them decide where internal controls would be appropriate. One of the great examples of this is a framework that's developed by the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, or COSO for short. The Committee of Sponsoring Organizations is made up of several academic and professional bodies, including the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, FEI, which is Financial Executives Institute, a professional board for C-suite executives. You have the AAA, the American Accounting Association, which is the academic arm, so professors and researchers. You have the IMA, the Institute of Management Accountants, and the IIA, the Institute of Internal Auditors. So they come together periodically, and they develop something called the COSO Internal Control Framework. Also lovingly called the COSO Cube. So the COSO Cube gives us multiple dimensions of data and different aspects of the organization that a company should be evaluating. This gives specific examples of how companies should develop their control environment, how they should assess risk, and where they should put internal controls to minimize that risk. The COSO framework, or the COSO cube, is going to show up on the CPA exam. Let's take a moment and look at some of the components of the COSO internal control framework. So if you're looking at the COSO cube, along the side, it includes 5 layers. And an easy way to remember these 5 layers is through an acronym. We've got CRIME, C-R-I-M-E, crime doesn't pay, or whatever you want. The first layer is the control environment. In other words, what is the tone that management sets for the organization, and how does that influence employees' behavior? We're going to call this tone at the top. The R is our risk assessment. So we're going to identify different risks that we accept and different responses for that. Then there's information and communication. So looking at communication models and identifying areas where there may be some risk. We have monitoring activities. So continually evaluating data and processes over time. And then we look at our existing control activities. You'll spend a lot of time in your auditing class going through this internal control framework, but I just want to pull in one little part that is particularly relevant to this unit. You're going to spend a lot of time in your auditing classes talking about the COSO internal control framework, but I want to pull out one of these aspects that's particularly relevant to this week's topics. Inside of our risk assessment, we have something called a risk response. And this tells us how companies are able to respond to different types of threats. There are 4 different responses that companies can take. And I'm going to use another acronym, SARA. The S stands for share. We can share risk by outsourcing it to other companies. Biggest example here is we can buy insurance. With insurance, we spread that loss so that we are not fully responsible if we should lose inventory or there should be a natural disaster or something like that. We can avoid risk by simply getting away from the threat. If I'm concerned about hurricanes, I'm going to move my facilities from Florida up to Pittsburgh. Or I could discontinue a portion of my business altogether. The next response is reduce. We can reduce our risk by implementing good internal controls, preventive, detective, corrective controls that we've already talked about. And then we can accept risk as simply a cost of doing business. So at a certain point, we decide that the cost of an internal control is more than the potential loss that we'd have if somebody steals from us. And so we just accept that as part of our cost. A good example of this is Amazon with porch pirates. If you have a package delivered on your porch by Amazon and somebody steals it off your porch, Amazon will send you a new item. So the cost of that item is just absorbed in the company's operations rather than having Amazon deal with the problem. All right, going back. So this is all part of the COSO cube, the internal control framework. There are other frameworks that companies can reference. For example, there's an organization called ISACA, the Information Systems Audit and Control Association. So ISACA is all about internal auditors and IT auditors and systems auditors. They have a special certification called a CISA, a Certified Information Systems Auditor, that they work and they are very much involved in internal controls for data and information systems. So they have a framework called the COBIT framework, Control Objectives over IT. This is specifically looking at IT systems. So as a manager, if I want to build in good privacy and security controls, I would look at COBIT for some suggested examples and self-assessments. Finally, companies aren't operating in a vacuum. There are other companies that are working on the same projects that are dealing with the same threats and doing the same things. And so frequently a company will look at other companies to see what they're doing and potentially implement those in their own company. So we look at other companies' practices. We call these best practices. And we try and copy them so that we can minimize our threats just like our competitors or our partners are throughout the supply chain. One last thing I want to mention is that when we're evaluating internal controls and evaluating risk, there's always going to be a comparison between the cost of the control and the benefit received. For example, the loss avoided. Both of these items have dollar signs attached to them. We can calculate the expected value of a loss given probabilities and the exposure within a company. We can also calculate how much it would cost to put in video cameras or security tags or RFID tags and so forth. In either case, if the cost of the control is less than the benefit received, then we are going to implement the internal control. If the sign is switched, then we accept that as a cost of doing business, or we look at one of these alternative risk approaches, buying insurance or avoiding the risk altogether. So take some time. I've posted a summary of these frameworks. Aside from understanding the layers of the COSO cube, you don't have to memorize everything for the exam, but it's interesting to see what is highlighted in each of these different frames. Can you think of an internal control that would be really effective at minimizing risk or eliminating risk, but the cost would be so prohibitively expensive that the company would lose money implementing the control? Once you look at that, let's meet up in the next video.